Hi everyone, I just wanted to go through some of the nutrition strategies. This is going to be, again, I think a three-parter, although I did say that with the last one, and I covered probably the bulk of it in two parts. So as you can see there, I'm an 83 kilo lifter. That picture was taken at about 84 kilos, so it's as I was coming down last time. So not my leanest, but I'm not particularly overweight. I'm not particularly shredded either, but I've not got a lot of room to play when I'm doing cuts and stuff like that. So, but obviously I can drop a bit of body fat, and that's kind of the way I'm looking at it. Now, some of the things we look at with nutrition, and I think this is a quote that someone told me once, is that nutrition is primarily for energy. We look at it, when we look at nutrition, sometimes we hear things about good and bad foods and stuff like that. But primarily, you have nutrition for energy. And why is that important? Well, someone had a quote once, they said, nutrition is primary for fuel, and fuel is for energy. Now, energy is really important because when you run out of energy, you die. So that's something that really sticks in my head when I think about energy. And it's always been something that I bear in mind. Now, the primary measure for energy is obviously calories. Now, as an 83 kilo lifter, and at the moment I'm sort of sitting around between 82.7 to about 83.5. So it is just bounced it up every day. I'm slowly pushing the nutrition up from where I was cutting a couple of weeks ago for Masters. So again, I'm not going to go from 2,000 calories back up to my baseline in one chunk. So I've been slowly pushing that back up, and this is how I've been doing it. So looking at my weight, 83 kilos, and my job, again, we also look at the fact that I have quite an active job. I don't sit at a desk. My baseline calories, and where we look at isocaloric, is going to be 2,816. If I took a 15% deficit off that, it's at about 2,393, which is roughly actually where I'd be about now. I sometimes take it up to 25% deficit if I need to drop that extra calories, but I don't really want to drop below that, and I don't like water and acute cuts. So when we look at baseline calories, what we're looking at is where we might mention it's isocaloric. And what I mean by isocaloric is that we neither gain or lose weight at those calories. Now, those calories, yeah, they're worked out on a calculator, but I have adjusted them over the years, and at different points in training or different points of activity, I will adjust them back and forth. The one thing I'll say about nutrition is I keep as much data on nutrition as I do on reps, sets, and intensity. Now, I'm going to go into weekly budget here, but the thing you need to remember is this is something we'll come back to in a minute, and why I talk about that. So the weekly budget is, across a week, I want 19,712 calories. In a deficit, I want 16,755 calories across the week. And I'll explain that a little bit more when we go into some of the examples later on. Okay, protein intake. So the top end of protein intake, as recommended by the ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine, the top end is going to be body weight times 2.2. That's 183 grams. Now, if we times 183 by 4, because there's 4 calories per gram of protein, that's 732 calories I take in from protein intake. So these things are going to eat into the budget. Now, the bottom end will be body weight times 1.6. So sometimes you just can't get protein. It's just not available. You may be working abroad, or you might be doing something else, or you might be on the move, or you might be on holiday. So sometimes you have got to drop it in, but that where it's going to be unavailable so readily, although we don't live in a country where that tends to happen, I'm quite happy to drop it to 1.6, and according to that, some of the protein recommendations, you can still maintain and build muscle on that. Again, that will be 133 grams based on my 83 kilo body weight, and you times that by 4, that's 532 calories. Carbohydrate. Okay, so let's have a look at carbohydrate, CHO intake. Now, depending on where you are and which phase of training you're in, so where I'd be in a peak, I want to be having my primary macronutrient will be carbohydrate. So the reason I say that, I mean, protein stays fairly static. I'll probably try and hit the top end wherever I can. Whereas carbohydrate is going to be very much an available energy source. And some people might like that, or some people might not use that. It's quite a high thing. I think when we're looking at that and we sometimes look at some of the calories we're getting from that, we think, oh, that's high. But actually, when you look at, say, an endurance athlete or someone who plays, say, football or rugby, and they have 7 times per kilo of body weight to 8 times for a match, and marathon runners from 10 to 12 times coming into peaking, I think the carbohydrate intake is fairly moderate for most gym goers and strength athletes. And if I'm doing a slightly more higher volume work, but the intensity is reasonably low, I might stay around the 4 mark, which would be about 332 calories, which is sort of where I'm at the moment. I'm slowly increasing that. And then when I get to, say, a peak or an end of a strength block, or even into a strength taper, I want to be at the high end here, mainly because it's also another lever you can pull if you need to drop that back to drop a bit of water. So because we are in a weight category sport. Okay, fat intake, you can't see that, it's kind of gone into that. Minimum baseline will be 0.5 per kilo of body weight, so that would be 42. Now we times it by 9, so as we know, carbohydrate is 4 calories per gram, protein is 4 calories per gram, but fat intake is a slightly higher, a more densely calorific macronutrient. So it's about 9 calories per gram. So this is where you want to watch it. This is where a lot of the hidden calories come. Even if you're doing like fat loss, I always find this is a little bit. So the minimal range is going to be about 42 grams. Mid-range, which is a lot of the time where we're going to be around, be about 83 grams. And the top range is sometimes we can push it up to this on a rest day, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. But that's roughly where we want to be for like rest days, or if we're trying to recover. Also good for things like hormonal intake, and it also slows up digestion. We can see where that later on I'll go into a little bit how that will benefit you. But I try to stay around the optimal range, or just below that actually, usually. So let's look at the weekly summary. So the bottom end for protein, we want about 532 calories for protein. Carbohydrate, the bottom end, we want about 1,000 calories from carbohydrate. And fats, we want about 380. Now that's 1,910 calories. So we can go to that if, like, say, again, we are in a weight category sport. We don't really want to. We want to kind of sort everything out before we start. And that's where we want to kind of run it through on that. And that will be the total calories from all 3 macronutrients. I mean, you could argue with alcohol and fibre, but I kind of include that in the carbohydrate mix. The top end, so this is where I'd like protein, so about 700 calories, which again in grams is usually about 183 grams. Carbohydrate, about 415 would be the top end, about 116. So definitely on training days, especially heavy training days, so things like legs, deadlifts, anything with massively high volume, maybe not so much upper body, but sometimes it's rare I'll do just upper body on its own. I might do some secondary lift on that day, and that will take us up to 3,107 calories. Now if you remember the initial isocaloric calories, so if you are trying to lose weight, is for me 2,816. But if we're playing with that range and we're looking at the dynamic range, this is kind of where we want to flip between the two. These are two extremes. Now, very often when we look at like fat loss and transformation coaches, they'll kind of stick down this end, and then we look at the people that do the bulk, they kind of go up this end. Now, obviously, I know from years of experience, it doesn't really matter where you put it, as long as across the week you're meeting your energy demands. And when we look at sports performance, that's really where we want to look at things. And carbohydrate obviously is going to be a massive factor. When we look at body repair and building muscle, protein is going to be a factor, and recovery. And fats again helps things like digestion and hormonal stuff, regards to anything else. So the strength block and the 4-day peaking protocol. So optimizing calorific flow. So what we're using here as an example is, say you generally have like a base block or a foundation block or a GPP block, and this usually, or a washout block sometimes it's called, and this will be where you would have low to moderate volume, and you start building volume, low to moderate intensity, and what you're doing there is building up to that, and you'll go into a strength block where you start building strength through reps. I generally, as I go through these blocks, will just try and hit PBs at the end of the block for a certain amount of reps within reason, but we set it up a little bit like a trick shot in snooker. This is the way I'd sort of describe it. And then when we come across the thing, then we end up something like a bench session, and we'll look at that. So let's just look at the average week at the end of a strength block, just before we go into maybe a 4-week peaking block. So primary deadlifts, be heavy deadlift top set, followed by some reasonable volume, maybe a 4x4, and then some posterior chain work. So we might do some RDLs or some 45-degree back extensions, glute ham raises, some back work, something like that, some glute bridges, something like that. So for something like this, I'd definitely go top end protein always. For something like this, nothing empties the tank like deadlifts. I don't care what anyone says. Very often, if I've had to hit a cut or it's been a bit extreme in competition, I just get my first 2 deadlifts and I haven't got enough fuel for my last deadlift. And that's a lot of the time what happens. And this is what I'm trying to do in the early blocks of training. So the first 3 weeks, I'm trying to get myself down to 81 so I can start having a few extra calories coming into the later blocks. So on a day like that, we'll go 3,139 calories. So that's quite a lot. That's way above the baseline. And if we go back to our baseline calories or isocaloric calories, that's 2,816. That's a little bit of a surplus. But on a day like that, you are going to use that energy, so that's okay. Upper body, again, I'd keep fats. I mean, this is the top end for fats, so we're keeping this fairly moderate. Carbohydrate, I go a bit more moderate for an upper body session. Again, depending on how heavy everything is, and if I'm mixing it up with, say, a secondary squat day, a secondary deadlift day, posterior chain day. Sometimes when I'm at the end of a block, because I can't chuck a load of leg work in one session, I might spread it across the block. And that would be 2,807, so that'd be roughly about baseline. Primary squat day, again, as we know, nothing empties the tank like deadlifts and squats. So, and we're doing that, maximal leg training, high caloric demand, and metabolic resistance. Again, 3,139 calories, roughly about the same as deadlift. 183 grams of that, 183 grams of that, and 83 grams of fat, of carbohydrate. So we really want that, especially towards the end of a block. We really need them glycogen stores in place and ready for that session as well. And then maybe Friday or Saturday I'll do my secondary bench. Again, probably sticking the same. Again, these can be slightly dynamic variables. What we don't take into account when we look at these numbers is digestion, hydration, things like that, because that can affect how much we can actually digest, how much we can take in during that period of time. And if we're finding the training quite stressful, I always find that can upset digestion a little bit. So remember we mentioned right at the beginning is the weekly baseline for calories. Now, this is where it becomes a little bit more interesting. So the weekly baseline is 19,712 calories, as we did, and that's our isocaloric baseline of 2,816 calories, and if we spread that across the week, times that by 7, that's 1,972 calories. Because what we want on them 2 training days, we want the most amount of calories, the most amount of carbohydrate, and that's what we want to use their macronutrients is around them training days. And maybe, especially when it gets heavier, on a recovery day as well. So we've got 3 recovery days and 4 training days. So if you actually put together, go back on this slide, we put together total daily calories for bench will be 2,807, 3,139 for lower body stuff. So we're just using that as a kind of, again, a lot of these are depending on how you train and what you do. So we know across our 4 days we've got 11,892 calories that we take from all 3 macronutrients. Now if we take that from our 19,712 calories, and we are left with 7,820 calories for our 3 rest days. Again, we still want to recover, and we still don't, just because we're not doing as much activity, it doesn't work like that. We still need that food and fuel to make sure that we build back our glycogen stores so we're at the best for our training days, and not overdoing it as well. One thing I used to do is obviously on a Sunday I used to overeat, and then I couldn't brace properly for my deadlift, or I'd end up wanting to halfway through the session empty the bowels, and that also affects hydration. I'm going to go into hydration in another part, but that's another thing. So fixed targets will be protein 1,800 calories, and on a rest day we don't need as much carbohydrate, but we still need to replenish, so we want to have about 250. That's about 3 times per kilo of body weight, so it'd be about 250 if you're 83, and these are the 2 we have from the subtotals. And then on a rest day I tend to have a little bit more fat. The reason being is we want carbohydrate we want to start gastric emptying. So if you've ever been an endurance runner, you'd understand that a little bit more. Obviously when we want glycogen availability and we want carbohydrate availability, if we go too low carb, we're just going to break down protein and use as glycogen. So on rest days we have about 2,600 calories because we split that by 4. So when we went back to this one, we've got 7,820 calories. You divide that by 3 and it goes to 2,600 calories. That's roughly what we can have on a rest day if we're looking about our baseline and we're in quite an intense volume and quite an intensity driven block. So we're just about to go into the taper and expose the strength. This would be definitely somewhere where you need to have a little bit more fuel. So hopefully you've understood all that. If you've got any questions, put it down in the thing below and I'll answer any question anyone has.